but a real thank you to Masha, to Sarah, Francis, my friend, Jan and Claire, Gabrielle, Laura, and Tyler for the really scintillating and interesting panel momentum already. In the theme, sorry, something went wrong. I think basically I'm going to be arguing today that Chernobyl too once appeared smart, once appeared environmental. So in this talk, a sliver of a book project, I will argue that the Soviet case of artificial intelligence, particularly how robots were imagined to do work in inhuman smart environments, helps us as observers today imagine a world already after at least partial ecological collapse. We are at the moment, as ever, perhaps, in a world facing significant challenges and environmental collapses. Headlines are full of the pressing realities of war, immigration, humanitarian crises, and on the long-term horizon looms a century-long, much longer indeed, process of climate change, much of which is already in the rearview mirror of our fossil-fueled political economy and Anthropocene. So the premise of my argument, I think, about Chernobyl today will generalize to maybe other less apocalyptic inhuman and human uninhabitable smart environments, such as, in decreasing order of horror here, war zones of former neighborhoods in which Ukrainians are resisting Russian invaders with smart javelin missiles. Yes, that's right. I actually want the second now, which is black. Thank you. I'll say next. Thank you. Or the smart fields, smart farms that are carefully plowed by auto-steer tractors, regulated by biochemical sensors and sprays, or surveilled by drones, or indeed tech labs that construct the circuitry of smart technology, or the highly temperature regulated air-conditioned server farms that, of course, power our economy and social lives and are powered often by coal. And of course, the smart city, whose apocalyptic imaginaries we've touched upon in many ways and often vacillates from being overrun by plant life in a post-human period to just kicking the humans out to begin with. Perhaps a smart move. My aim here throughout this kind of collage of class of examples is to offer an understanding of what comes after human habitable visions of smart collapses. And I do so by decentering the role of the human from kind of the anthropocentric vision of artificial intelligence, while also, of course, seeking human thriving. And I think you'll see in particular kind of the combination of two very contrasting and wildly insufficient ways of talking about ecological change, namely a world as we know it ending apocalypse and engineering arithmetic, carbon footprints, scorecards, carbon exchange markets, engineering tech solutions, among many other approaches to what we've called today epistemological ecologies. So here we go. If we could go to slide 3. In the hours before April 26, 1986, a runaway chain of reactions set into motion a disaster. At 1:23 in the middle of the night, the 4th reactor of Chernobyl in Ukraine exploded, ripping off the roof, igniting an infernal blaze of flame, fuel, and molten metal that launched at least 5% of its radioactive core into the atmosphere and wrapped the regions to the north and east and eventually the globe in a plume of radiation. The explosion itself was not nuclear, but the disaster came as highly radioactive fission pellets in the burning graphite escaped into the atmosphere. As one observer put it, "I didn't see this explosion itself, just the flames. Everything was radiant. The whole sky, a tall flame and smoke. The heat was awful." The fire burned the entire night and then glowed for 10 days with helicopters and about 1,000 emergency responders dropping sand and boron to repress the fire and radiation. In the coming weeks and months, Soviet authorities struggled to cover up the worst civil nuclear disaster in history. Next slide, please. Over 120,000 people were evacuated from the 1,600 square mile exclusion zone. Some 30 years later, unofficial figures of the premature deaths range between 4,000, that's the UN estimate, to 1 million, that's Greenpeace, with many kind of averaging out around mid 30,000. A nuclear facility in eastern Sweden was the first to publicly detect abnormally high radiation levels, and the cause, excuse me, while initially blamed on the operators who died, were poorly understood vulnerabilities in the so-called smart design of the nuclear reactor, unlike those found in now the more larger and hopefully more stable Zaporozhye nuclear power plant that was shelled and seized by Russian army last week. Gorbachev once claimed that the Chernobyl contributed more to the fall of the Soviet Union than his liberalization reform efforts of perestroika, glasnost, and uskорение. Next slide, please. The fourth nuclear reactor and the surrounding areas suddenly became, if you would, extraterrestrial. No humans could safely inhabit the reactor, although in fact biodiversity in the exclusion zone has grown since, as animals, plants, and indeed over 1,000 local inhabitants have returned to live in now contaminated areas. Time reduced the immediate threat radius, and due to the energy shortfalls across recently independent Ukraine, almost 6,000 workers continued to operate in the other 3 nuclear reactors, reportedly within international safety limits, until a turbine hall fire shut down 1 reactor in 1991, another closed in 1997, and the last closed in 2000. The environmental situation was at a time unprecedented. No one had ever dealt with problems on this scale before, it seemed. Late in 1986, and despite promises that, quote, only robots would be sent into the most dangerous areas, a decision was made to clear up the worst areas by hand. Next slide. Over 3,000 men, or liquidators, this comes from the famous Chernobyl show, nuclear jumpers, or as they sometimes were referred to themselves, storks, or green robots for the color of their uniform, or even bio-robots, dressed in lead vests and helmets to protect their vital organs, and were assigned to sprint shovel radioactive waste for a few minutes at a time off of the roof of the 3rd reactor before the first sarcophagus structure could be installed. Their sacrifice was staggering, and many of them received radiation dosage of thousands of X-rays at once and died horribly or were disabled by radiation poisoning. Well, now could robots have prevented such human tragedy? Roboticists from around the world, including Valery Rybak, a Ukrainian cyberneticist at the Institute of Cybernetics in Kiev, noted in an interview with me that he urgently attempted to save human lives by sending robots into the uninhabitable zone. Next slide. In the long term, robots have proven helpful in navigating and handling radioactive and toxic materials, conducting inspections and repairs. However, at the time of crisis, in the moment the reactor was least habitable, robots resembling combinations of bulldozers, cranes, and tanks proved tragically ineffective. Robots sent from Germany, the US, and Japan simply did not work well enough. The radiation levels inside the reactor interfered with the radio levels and radio waves connecting the camera-enabled robots to their operators at a safe distance. And indeed, I'm developing elsewhere this sort of strong correlation between the introduction of the digital age with the flash of Hiroshima and the curious rereading of what that digital age might be if we took not the computer, but the radio behind the radioactive as its fundamental metaphor. Next slide, please. Dark humor might help us capture something of this horrific tragedy. One soldier joked, invoking a kind of self-sacrificing patriotism, motivating the young men on the roof, quote, an American robot is on the roof for 5 minutes, then it breaks down. A Japanese robot is on the roof for 5 minutes and it too breaks down. The Russian robot is up there for 2 hours. Then a command comes in over the loudspeaker. Private Ivanov, in 2 hours, you're welcome to come down and have a cigarette break. Alas, none of the robots and all of the humans proved quick enough for the Soviet government, and the state's motivations to avoid further contamination or further catastrophe could surely be understood, even if the decision to throw manual labor at the problem may remain, if not forever painful, also unforgivable. Like the original 1986 Chernobyl catastrophe, the uninhabitable zone of outer space is another environment where, in most crisis situations, the likelihood of mistaking a human for a machine is simply zero, just as the cooperation between the two is nearly total. Next slide, please. Namely, the task that Rybak and others tackled in the 1990s was a kind of Theseus paradox, or that old sailor's problem. How do you repair the ship, in this case the International Space Station, when it is already at sea? In constructing the corridor, in particular, how does one build a corridor extending from the space station when that also means that constructing the corridor one piece at a time in freezing temperatures of outer space? Rybak's solution should seem a standard engineering solution. Next slide, please. A robotic arm, it's not this one, but similar, fixed atop of a construction cube suspended at the end of a space station could build the next unit of this station's corridor one section at a time in a self-constructing loop. This would permit the space station to construct itself in space in ways that it found modularly useful. It never came to be, such a smart design. Since then, space station units have been constructed using pre-assembled materials on Earth, which are then launched into space. Next slide. The difference between human and machine could not be more consequential or obvious in the limit scenarios of Chernobyl and the International Space Station here. Here you see no uncanny valley. Here you see no kind of anthropomorphic resemblance of man or human and machine. And indeed, thank goodness that robots are not humans in such situations, or rather, far more darkly, rings the Soviet administrator's position. Thank goodness that our robots are not machines. This is an aversion we've seen today is of how smart cities can treat robots too as citizens. At the same time, it seems obvious at first glance that both limit cases, Chernobyl and the International Space Station, seek to project human senses of the engineer operator into a machine at a greater remove. And so it's just kind of an organ projection through engineering. I think there's something else at work, namely what's at call in that a robot can repair and rebuild an inhuman environment. In a larger work that I don't have time to explore here, I develop how Rybak and others developed what I call a doubled smart environmental vision that is neither human nor machine, but involves the collaboration of both. And it is also not an easy extension of this kind of anthropomorphic vision of smartness, or what Ernst Kopp called organ projection, Organprojektion, 100 years before McLuhan would make it popular. Perhaps instead I'll draw this to a conclusion. Given that all worlds, given all possible worlds, there's a pretty good chance, it would seem, that any given world has already ended and that it was also never quite inhabitable. Next slide, please. About 2 weeks ago, the post-apocalyptic space of Chernobyl was occupied by an invading Russian army. Even if the Ukrainian resistance succeeds in withstanding this Russian invasion, the vulnerability of Chernobyl will remain militarized. And should the Russian army sabotage it, Chernobyl may again spill radioactive substance into Ukraine, Eurasia, and the ionosphere. Something similar perhaps holds for Russian tanks with thermal imagers shooting at the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. Next slide, please. Most possible Chernobyl worlds before 2 weeks ago, namely that stack of first-person shooter games set in post-apocalyptic scenarios overrun by mutated creatures, man-machine soldiers, radiation-induced delusions, and ideological aftershocks were, in retrospect of these headlines, both too dramatic and not nearly apocalyptic enough. And if you could just slowly scroll through the next 3. What you're seeing here is the actual art, the actual design, the residual apocalypse that is expressed in art. And then the next slide. These are all local to the region. And one more. And we just end here, thank you. I think the point for me is that war, catastrophe, and other human ruin, as Benjamin hints, tragically imitates art in its terrible destruction here and now of our local memorials to the ends of worlds. Smartness, it seems, does something similar to this. It both belongs to and is an extension of the Chernobyl case. By occupying uninhabitable zones, the promise of smartness posits an advantage, some abstraction that Tyler's described for us, that makes the demand of intelligence both infinite as well as its supply seem ever in shortage. Smartness in turn then reveals itself, like Chernobyl, to be uninhabitable by real human bodies, but also simultaneously very, very real. Smartness, as the root from the German Schmerz for pain suggests, simply smarts. It stings, it cuts, it embeds itself into our material lives. Can we not see a similar smart view of the world by considering how many worlds past, once considered smart, have come and gone? Can we not feel the painful embodied realities of these smart environments that have amplified and responded to the apocalyptic horsemen at present, racism, despots, disease, and war? Can we not see in smartness the trans-historical modern historical trend of ending local worlds with the ever-accelerating turns of the gears of modernity, the searing of metal, the subjugation of endless artifice, to our whim, the imperial ambitions of capital and colony, ships, trains, industry, the mass warfare, the exclusive home, the smart city, and now artificial intelligence? As an act of synecdoche, I hope this talk has taken the inhuman collapse of the smart nuclear Chernobyl world as a case study of some more generalizable phenomenon of uninhabitable smart environments. Perhaps if we can see how the Soviet citizens once imagined a union smartly powered by nuclear fusion is indeed an outer space smartly occupied by its stations, and then being suddenly left without a home, then so too can we today better prepare to not just imagine, but prepare against a future and a present that is already after the Anthropocene. Thank you.